Hey guys, I'm Heather Shannon with HWCA of Chicago, a holistic mental health practice located in the Wicker Park neighborhood. We offer psychotherapy, health coaching, and mindfulness programs.
And I'm Todd, the owner of South Loop Strength and Conditioning in the South Loop of Chicago.
Hey.
Hi.
So today we're going to talk to you guys a little bit about mindfulness and how you can incorporate that in exercises. So what do you see with your athletes in terms of performing an exercise and how they could bring more mindfulness to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the big things to think about in terms of mindfulness and sort of a very moment-to-moment aspect with training comes in terms of both form on exercises and pacing during workouts in something like CrossFit, right? So to start with, when you talk about form, right, 'cause this is something that a lot of people are concerned about. They want to have correct form. They want to avoid injury. They want to do exercises correctly.
Right.
They want to progress long term.
Exactly.
All that type of stuff. And what they end up doing is they can kind of get themselves sort of worked up into, sort of a tizzy of sorts, trying to make sure they're doing everything right all the time.
I might be guilty of that myself. Going through an exercise thinking, okay, suck the stomach in, squeeze the glutes, don't slouch, keep everything right. There's a lot of things that I'm trying to think about at once.
Yeah, exactly right, which is it's very difficult to perform well when you kind of have 100 thoughts running through your head. It sort of subtracts from the actual experience of performing the movement, which is one of the best ways to actually improve your form, is to be able to feel the movement and then recognize, did that one feel good? Did that one feel bad? Right? Can I make this feel better on the next rep? Or did that one feel a little bit sketchy for some reason? Maybe I need to, make a small adjustment and then I can feel better on the next one.
Okay. And how do we do that safely? Like if we're just learning a new exercise and we're kind of like afraid to do something wrong and get hurt, what would your advice be?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the big areas where this sort of checklist mental self-talk where people are flipping out about stuff comes from fear, right?
Yeah.
It's either fear of getting hurt or fear of not making the lift or fear of looking foolish because you're doing it wrong, and that sort of ramps up that self-talk of okay, hips, knees, fast, slow, right?
Yeah.
At some level, if you're experiencing this fear, it's difficult to just turn it off, right? You can't just say, "Oh, okay, well,
just don't be afraid."
That's just fear. Whatever. But if you can recognize that may be where some of this chatter comes from, that can be very powerful. But I think the biggest thing is understanding the distinction between regulating yourself based upon feel and regulating yourself based upon your own mental voice, right?
Yeah, it's almost like by trying to be too perfect, we make it worse.
Exactly. And there's, over the course of learning a skill, there's sort of the concept of switching from, unconscious incompetence, right, to conscious incompetence.
A necessary step.
Yeah, exactly, right, to conscious competence to unconscious competence, right?
So I like that progression idea.
Yeah, right. So basically you don't know what you're doing, and you don't know that you don't know what you're doing.
Right.
Then you get started with something. This is kind of the phrase that we were talking about. You're like, okay, let's say I'm trying to learn a snatch, and I really need to try to think about what I'm doing, and I recognize that I suck at it.
Right.
And I'm like, okay, I just really keep the bar close, elbows up to start with.
Right.
Get the bar into the hip, and then you do it, and you're shit, it sucked. Right? And then over enough repetitions, then you start to become competent with it, but you still kind of have to think about each step of the way, and it still may look overly mechanical to a coach, right? Because a coach can sort of see, are you just feeling the movement, or are you sort of thinking piece by piece?
Right.
And then once you kind of do that enough times, then you can sort of ingrain the motor pattern and just do it correctly without really thinking about it. Right?
Sounds great.
Yeah, you're just feeling it. I mean, you may have, a certain cue that works for you. Like on the snatch, I know for me, I need to think about pulling the bar back in the whole time, right? So, throughout the course of the movement, a lot of stuff is happening. I'm shifting my weight back, I'm pulling my knees back, I'm shifting my weight forward, I'm pulling the bar back into the hip, I'm extending explosively, but you don't think about that stuff. For me, the only thing I think about is this one little piece, right? Because I think that you get one or two things you can think about while you're doing a movement, and if you try to stack more on top of it, it ends up confusing you and making it overly mechanical.
Right. It's almost like, when I give homework to my health coaching clients, I never give them more than one or two, because then you're sort of just diluting the information instead of really choosing something you're going to make progress with.
Yeah, exactly. And it sort of leads to an overwhelm.
Exactly.
Right? You can't kind of process all that stuff at once, and then it makes it more difficult. So I think that the concept of this mindfulness going through this process is huge, because yes, you are going to have to struggle with it.
Right.
You are going to have to think about it too much and sort of find your path to improving your movement. But recognizing that the way that you improve is by improving your understanding of how it feels, not by adding items to your mental checklist,
right,
is huge.
And the way you're describing it, it sounds like part of it is self-awareness, and part of it is kind of having a good coach too, who can be aware for you of where you're at and provide sort of the general form cues and what you specifically might want to focus on. Like you mentioned, you have one or two things for the snatch.
Yeah, and that's I think that's one of the subtleties of good coaching that's very difficult to teach and to explain. But I sort of think of it as triaging, right? Yeah. Where if I'm watching someone perform a movement, especially if they're new and it's a complicated movement, they may be doing literally 25 things wrong. Right? Where it's
kind of
like,
scary.
Yeah, but it's like, oh man, like, you need to squat by initiating at your hip and knee simultaneously, your right knee's buckling in, you don't have good hip flexion, so you're starting to lose that lumbar curve at the bottom, you shift your weight forward as you come up, you keep your butt too far back so it kind of comes up too early, you arch your back excessively as you're standing, you don't reach full hip extension up top, right? Like all these things.
This is just a basic squat that most of us think we know how to do just fine.
Yeah, and all these things could be happening at once, but if you take an athlete and you say, listen, here's the checklist of things that you're doing wrong, here's all 20 of them, like fix them, that's not helpful.
No.
That no one can...
They can't fix 20 at once.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's totally unhelpful. So I think one of the big things with coaching is understanding, how do I pick one thing that's going to give me more results than the rest, right?
Yeah.
So...
Sounds like a good approach to life.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly, right? But and you're not always necessarily right as a coach, but you want to sort of say, okay, what is the most important thing? Right. And it's not just having a grab bag of cues like knees out, chest up.
Right.
It's like, what is this person's biggest flaw that could potentially be causing other ones as well?
That's a good point.
Right.
So everything's interconnected.
Yeah, exactly. Improper initiation on the squat, so just only shoving your knees forward on a squat rather than initiating at hip and knee simultaneously can actually cause a lot of those other problems that we sort of mentioned.
Okay.
Right, and if you fix that one, then other stuff can come into place, and then you can sort of re-triage based upon that. So
nice.
In terms of a coaching perspective, the goal is to sort of say, what can I give this athlete to focus on that is going to allow them to see the most improvement, right? And then I can also kind of calm that mental chatter down and say, here's your thing. I want you to pay attention to how this feels, see if it feels different than your previous rep. Right. See if it feels better, and then try to internalize that feeling and then carry it over into the next one.
And then it just becomes muscle memory eventually.
Yeah, exactly. Because that's how people learn to do it, is they have to understand the feeling of doing it quote unquote correctly.
Right.
And then they don't need someone, to be watching them all the time.
Right.
Because they know what good movement feels like, and then they can, iterate upon that themselves.
So we're really going from kind of an intellectual framework to just a being fully in your body framework.
Yeah, it's very much about body awareness and really connecting with this feels like this.
Yeah.
And then being able to call upon that feeling on your own.
Nice.
Yeah.
So you mentioned pacing is a part of the mindfulness approach with exercise too. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, for sure. So in the context of doing something like a CrossFit workout, or running a race, pace is very, very important, right? Because you basically have to say, okay, this is roughly the time frame I'm going to be working for. This is roughly the amount of work that I have to do. And I need to go at a pace that is going to get me the best result for that time frame, right? And when we think about pacing, we sort of think about, setting expectations in terms of what it's going to feel like as we do it, and then adjusting based upon reality.
Makes sense.
Right? So you sort of say, okay, say I'm going to do this workout. It's going to be 8 minutes long.
Okay.
It's going to be handstand push-ups and power cleans,
okay.
which is the most recent open workout. And you should have an idea, okay, at what point are the handstand push-ups going to get hard? At what point are the cleans going to get hard? What's it going to feel like? Is it going to be my shoulders are fatigued? Is it going to be I'm out of breath? And you sort of craft an expectation in your head, and then you attempt to do the workout based upon that expectation.
So it sounds like by the time you're pretty seasoned with these, you get to a point where you just know yourself really well and you know what to expect. What about someone who is more of a newbie to this type of workout?
Yeah, exactly. And what ends up happening is it's always a learning process, right? Because even if you are seasoned, you have an expectation, and then reality, sometimes you're right. Other times you're just totally off.
Okay.
So I think that's where a lot of the mindfulness comes in, is how do you react to the difference between expectation and reality in terms of pacing.
That's a really good point, because expectations can really get in our way. Sometimes in this case, maybe they're necessary as a starting point, but without that sense of clinging to them, that, this must be how it goes.
Yes, exactly, right. And I think that applies whether you're a newbie or you're a high-level athlete. A high-level athlete is probably going to have better expectations for themselves. It's probably more accurate, right? But newbies are going to experience the same thing, where they're sort of like, oh man, like, I don't even know if I can do this, whatever. And then
that's a good point.
Yeah, and then they start doing it, and then you have to see, okay, what does this feel like relative to my expectation? And then that sort of sets your fatigue level, right? Because you have sort of a central fatigue mechanism that will slow you down or speed you up depending upon how you feel relative to how you think you should feel.
Okay.
Right? And people who are really good are very good at adapting in the moment.
I love that.
Yeah, they have a plan, but like you said, they can sort of say, okay, this isn't feeling the way I thought it felt. And then what is your thought process then?
Exactly. And that it's so interesting talking to you about what it's like with exercise, because it's the same things that I talk about with my therapy and coaching clients too.
Yeah.
How do we learn to be flexible and adaptable in life, because we're not going to be able to predict how everything goes, and we're not going to be able to have everything go our way. There's a lot we're not in control of.
Yeah, exactly, right. It's the same concept, in business or in social situations. You have an expectation, and then it's not met. What do?
Adjust.
Right? And then how do you improve your ability to adjust to be as good as possible?
Yeah. And to be as kind and gentle with yourself as possible too, especially if we had, overly high expectations, or we're really hopeful about something turning out a certain way and then it didn't. How can we be, kind and compassionate with ourselves and stay motivated to just kind of keep taking the next step forward?
Yeah, exactly, right? Because if you can't adjust, or if you, make big, judgments upon yourself based upon a disparity between reality and expectations, then you can very easily just shut yourself down.
Completely.
Right?
Forget this. I can't do it. I'm never going to try again.
Exactly. Right. It happens to people in workouts. You just see them, they're like, oh, done.
Right.
Done. Right. And it happens to people in, business situations.
Absolutely.
It happens to people in social situations where their expectations aren't met, and they just, they quit.
Yeah, so don't quit on yourselves, guys.
Yeah. Don't quit on yourselves.
That's our lesson for today.